The stagecoach rattled to a halt in the mud-churned street of Eldridge, Montana, under a sky heavy with the promise of early winter snow. Eleanor Hayes stepped down, her boots sinking into the cold slurry that passed for a road, the hem of her wool skirt already heavy with damp. She clutched her carpetbag in one gloved hand, the other pressing against her chest as if to steady the erratic beat of her heart. At 28, she carried the weight of a life unraveled back east. A hasty marriage to a man who'd promised the world and delivered only bruises and betrayal, followed by a divorce that branded her as damaged goods in the eyes of polite society. But here, in this raw edge of the frontier, she'd hoped for a fresh start. A letter from her distant cousin, Martha, had beckoned. "Come west, Ellie. There's work, and folks don't ask too many questions." The air bit sharp, carrying the scent of pine smoke from chimneys and the metallic tang of impending frost. Eldridge sprawled before her like a half-built dream, wooden storefronts leaning against each other for support, a saloon spilling laughter and tinny piano music into the dusk, and a cluster of townsfolk bundled in coats, eyeing the newcomer with the wariness reserved for strangers. Eleanor scanned the faces, searching for Martha's familiar round cheeks and kind eyes. Instead, a wiry man in a faded overcoat approached, his mustache twitching with discomfort. "You, Eleanor Hayes?" he asked, his voice gravelly, avoiding her gaze. "Yes, sir. I'm here to stay with my cousin, Martha Wilkins." He shifted his weight, glancing at the gathering onlookers, a shopkeeper sweeping his porch, a pair of women whispering behind gloved hands. "Martha. She passed sudden like 2 weeks back. Fever took her. Didn't leave no instructions 'bout kin comin'." Eleanor's breath caught, a cold fist twisting in her gut. The world tilted, the distant mountains blurring into a gray haze. Passed? But her letter. It arrived just last month. The man shrugged, his sympathy thin as the fading light. "Frontier's harsh, ma'am. No place for a woman alone, especially one with... Well, word travels. Your history back east. Folks here got standards. Church ladies already talkin'." She felt the sting like a slap, the judgment seeping into her bones colder than the wind whistling through the gaps in the buildings. Whispers rippled. Divorced. Ruined. What kind of woman? Her cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin, refusing to let the tears spill. The stagecoach driver cracked his whip, the horses snorting plumes of steam as the vehicle lumbered away, leaving her stranded in the gathering twilight. Alone now, Eleanor stood amid the indifferent bustle, the scent of baking bread from a nearby bakery mocking her empty stomach. The first flakes of snow began to fall, soft and relentless, dusting her shoulders like forgotten ash. She had $50 sewn into her petticoat, a few dresses, and a heart scarred but unbroken. The town turned its back, doors closing one by one as lamps flickered to life in windows. But in the quiet ache of rejection, a spark of resolve flickered too. She would not beg nor break. Not here, not yet. The frontier might swallow the weak, but she had come to endure. Eleanor trudged through the gathering snow, the wind slicing through her threadbare shawl as she followed a narrow path to the edge of Eldridge. The town's lights faded behind her, their warmth as unreachable as the stars now obscured by clouds. Her carpetbag swung heavy in her hand, the weight of her few possessions, a Bible, a silver locket from her mother, a worn copy of Jane Eyre, anchoring her to the earth when her heart wanted to unravel. Martha's death left her anchorless, the promise of a cousin's hearth replaced by the reality of a cold, unyielding frontier. The man at the stagecoach stop had pointed her to a boarding house, but his warning lingered. Mrs. Grayson, don't take kindly to your sort. The boarding house loomed ahead, a sagging two-story structure with peeling paint and a single lantern swaying in the wind. Eleanor knocked, her knuckles stinging against the rough wood. The door creaked open, revealing a woman with a face like weathered granite, her eyes narrowing as they took in Eleanor's travel-stained dress and the faint bruise of exhaustion under her eyes. "Name's Grayson," the woman said, voice sharp as a blade. "Room's $10 a month, paid up front. No men, no liquor, no trouble. Heard about you already. Divorced, they say. I'll be watchin'." Eleanor swallowed the sting of judgment, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I've got money, ma'am. I'll keep to myself." Mrs. Grayson grunted, stepping aside to let her pass. The room was a closet of a space, a narrow cot, a cracked wash basin, a single window rattling in its frame. The air smelled of damp wood and lye soap, and the walls seemed to lean inward, as if whispering the town's disdain. Eleanor set her bag down, the thud echoing in the silence. She unpinned her hat, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from the weight of being so utterly alone. Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the world. She knelt by the cot, unpacking her belongings with care, as if each item could stitch her fractured courage back together. The locket gleamed faintly, its clasp stiff from disuse. She didn't open it. Some wounds were too raw for moonlight. Instead, she pulled Jane Eyre to her chest, its pages soft from years of reading, a reminder of a woman who'd faced rejection and carved her own path. Eleanor's breath fogged in the chill air as she sat on the cot, the springs creaking under her weight. The town's whispers seemed to seep through the walls, but she closed her eyes, letting the quiet settle. She'd survived worse, blows that left marks, words that cut deeper. Here, in this cold room, she would begin again. Not with hope, not yet, but with the stubborn will to endure. The wind howled, but she did not flinch. The days blurred into a rhythm of quiet determination as winter tightened its grip on Eldridge. Eleanor rose before dawn in her cramped room, the frost etching lace patterns on the window pane, her breath visible in the dim light of a single candle. She had no time for self-pity. Survival demanded action. With the $50 dwindling, she pinned a handwritten notice on the boarding house door. Mending, sewing, baking. Reasonable rates. Her hands, once idle in a loveless marriage back east, now became her salvation. Nimble fingers threading needles, kneading dough, patching worn fabrics that carried the stories of strangers' lives. Her first job came from the mercantile owner, Mr. Harlan, who handed her a stack of frayed shirts with a grunt, his eyes flicking over her as if assessing a dubious investment. "Don't dawdle, woman, and keep your head down. Folks round here don't cotton to scandal." Eleanor nodded, her expression serene, though his words pricked like thorns. She worked in the back room of the store sometimes, the scent of coffee beans and tobacco mingling with the sharp tang of lye from the laundry tubs. Other times, she baked in Mrs. Grayson's kitchen, the warmth of the oven a brief respite from the cold that seeped into her bones. The townsfolk watched her with sidelong glances, their judgments woven into the fabric of daily life. At the general store, women in calico dresses whispered behind bolts of cloth. "Divorced and bold as brass, thinks she can just waltz in here." A rancher's wife returned a mended quilt with a sniff, claiming the stitches were uneven, though Eleanor knew they were flawless. Children pointed, their mothers shushing them with warnings about that kind of woman. The church bell tolled on Sundays, but Eleanor stayed away, unwilling to face the pious stares in the pews. Instead, she read her Jane Eyre by candlelight, drawing strength from Jane's unyielding spirit, her own resolve hardening like ice on the river. Yet, amid the rejection, small victories bloomed. A miner's widow paid her fairly for a batch of apple tarts, the fruit's tart sweetness, a rare indulgence in the sparse winter larder. Eleanor saved every coin, sewing them into her hem like secrets. Her hands ached from the work, calluses forming where softness once reigned, but she refused to crumble. Each stitch was a declaration. I am here. I endure. One afternoon, as snow flurried outside the mercantile, Eleanor glanced up from her sewing to see a tall figure in the doorway. A man with dark hair tied back, his coat dusted with frost, cradling a bundled infant against his chest. His features spoke of Lakota heritage, eyes sharp and wary, marked by the outcast's solitude. He scanned the shelves quietly, avoiding the clerk's suspicious gaze. Eleanor felt a pang of kinship in his isolation, but she bent her head back to her work, the needle pulling thread through fabric, like a lifeline in the storm. The mercantile's bell jingled softly as the door opened, admitting a gust of frigid air that carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Eleanor looked up from her sewing corner, where she was mending a pair of wool trousers, the needle pausing mid-stitch. It was him again, the man she'd glimpsed days before, his presence as quiet and unassuming as the falling snow. He moved through the aisles with purposeful grace, the infant bundled against his chest in a woven sling that spoke of traditions older than the town itself. His name, she'd learned from overheard whispers, was Thomas Blackfeather, a Lakota widower who'd drifted to Eldridge after losing his wife to the fever that swept the plains last spring. The townsfolk called him an outcast, their eyes narrowing at his braided hair and the beaded amulet peeking from his collar. But he bore their stares with a stoic dignity that mirrored her own. Thomas approached the counter, setting down a sack of flour and a tin of coffee, his dark eyes scanning the shelves without haste. The baby stirred faintly, a soft whimper escaping the bundle, and he murmured something low in a language Eleanor didn't understand, his hand gently patting the child's back. The clerk, Mr. Harlan, rang up the items with curt efficiency, his mouth twisting slightly as he handed over the change. "That all, Blackfeather?" "Don't linger. Got real customers waitin'." Thomas nodded, his expression unchanging, but Eleanor caught the subtle tightening of his jaw, the quiet endurance of yet another slight. As he turned to leave, his gaze met hers across the room, not lingering, not intrusive, but steady, like recognizing a fellow traveler on a lonely road. She offered a small nod, her fingers resuming their work on the trousers, the thread pulling taut as if binding something deeper. Later that week, he returned, this time with a ripped blanket draped over his arm. He placed it on the counter, addressing Mr. Harlan. "Needs mending. Strong stitches. Winters biting hard." Harlan glanced at Eleanor, jerking his head. "She handles that. Hayes, see to it." Eleanor rose, smoothing her apron, and approached. Up close, Thomas smelled of leather and earth, his eyes the color of polished obsidian, holding no pity for her rumored past, only a quiet curiosity. "How soon?" he asked, his voice deep and even, like the rumble of a distant river. "By tomorrow evening," she replied, her tone matching his calm. She unfolded the blanket, noting the intricate patterns woven into the wool, symbols of stars and eagles, faded but resilient. "It's beautiful work. I'll treat it with care." He watched her hands trace the tier, not speaking, but something softened in his stance, a silent acknowledgement. The baby cooed, reaching a tiny fist toward the fabric. and Thomas adjusted the sling with gentle precision. "Thank you," he said simply, before turning away. As the door closed behind him, Eleanor felt a subtle shift, like the first crack in winter's ice. Not rescue, not romance, but a spark of mutual respect in the cold vastness. She threaded her needle anew, the blanket's patterns echoing her own scarred heart, mending one stitch at a time. Winter deepened in Eldridge, the snow piling against door frames like forgotten regrets, the air crisp with the scent of wood smoke and frozen earth. Eleanor's days settled into a quiet cadence of work, mending by lamplight, baking in the pre-dawn chill, her hands moving with the steady rhythm of one who had learned to rebuild from scraps. The townsfolk's whispers had dulled to a background hum, like the wind through the pines. She met their gazes with calm indifference, her resilience a shield forged in solitude. But in the mercantile's dim corners, where the shelves groaned under tins of beans and bolts of calico, an unspoken thread began to weave itself between her and Thomas Blackfeather. He came twice a week now, his visits as predictable as the river's flow. Sometimes for flour or salt, other times for thread or a new lantern wick. Always with the baby. Little Anna he'd let slip once, nestled against him, her dark eyes wide and curious. Thomas never lingered at the counter, but his path often led him near Eleanor's sewing table, where she worked on commissions under Mr. Harlan's grudging eye. He'd nod in greeting, a subtle incline of his head, and she'd return it, her needle pausing just long enough to acknowledge the quiet presence that felt like a balm in the cold. One afternoon, as sleet tapped against the window panes, Thomas approached with a small bundle, a deerskin pouch frayed at the edges. "For mending," he said, unfolding it to reveal a tear along the seam. Eleanor took it carefully, her fingers brushing the soft hide, feeling the warmth it retained from his touch. It smelled of sage and open plains, a world apart from the store's musty confines. "I'll make it strong," she promised, her voice soft, threading a needle with sinew she kept for such work. He watched her begin, not speaking, but standing a moment longer than necessary. Anna gurgled, reaching toward Eleanor's hands, and without thinking, Eleanor smiled, a genuine curve of her lips that softened the lines of weariness on her face. Thomas's eyes met hers, holding a quiet depth, as if seeing the strength she hid beneath her composed exterior. "She likes the motion," he said finally, his words simple, focused on the now, the flicker of the needle, the child's delight. No questions about her past, no pity for her solitude, just the present, shared in silence. Their exchanges grew like that, small, layered with subtext. He'd leave a sprig of dried lavender on the counter one day. "For the scent in baking," he murmured, knowing she made tarts for the widow down the street. She'd mend his gloves without charge, adding extra stitching for warmth, a gesture unspoken, but felt. In the evenings, alone in her room, Eleanor would trace the patterns on the items he brought, symbols of eagles and rivers that spoke of endurance, mirroring her own quiet perseverance. The affection bloomed not in words, but in these gestures, a slow thaw in the winter of her heart. Thomas saw her, not the divorced woman the town scorned, but the one who mended what was broken, stitch by careful stitch. As the days shortened, their connection deepened in the spaces between speech. One evening, as he collected a repaired shirt, the store empty save for them, he paused at the door. "The cold bites harder alone," he said, his voice low, eyes on the swirling snow outside. Eleanor nodded, feeling the truth of it, but also the warmth of his regard, a silent promise that perhaps, in time, the isolation could ease. As the winter solstice approached, Eldridge hunkered under a blanket of unrelenting snow. The days short and shadowed, the nights endless with the howl of winds that carried echoes of isolation. Eleanor's hands had grown accustomed to the bite of cold needles and the warmth of oven embers, her work a steady anchor in the storm of whispers that still trailed her like ghosts. She mended coats for ranchers, baked loaves for the mercantile, each task a quiet affirmation of her place in this unforgiving land. But in the quiet hours after dusk, her thoughts turned to Thomas and little Anna, their shared silences in the store weaving a fragile warmth into her days. She saw in him a mirror of her own wounds, the loss of his wife, the town's wary distance, and it stirred something deep, a desire to offer more than stitches or nods. One evening, in the dim glow of her room's lantern, Eleanor kneaded dough with purposeful care, the flour dusting her apron like fresh snow. She wasn't baking for commission this time. Instead, she formed a small apple tart, the fruit salvaged from the last of the season's withered stores, spiced with cinnamon she'd bartered for at the store. The scent filled the cramped space, sweet and comforting, evoking memories of her mother's kitchen before life had turned harsh. But this tart was for them, for Thomas, who braved the cold with Anna strapped close, his quiet strength a beacon in her solitude. It was a risk, this gesture. To give something handmade was to extend a piece of her heart, vulnerable to rejection in a town quick to judge intent. The next day, as flurries danced outside the mercantile's frost-laced windows, Thomas entered, shaking snow from his boots, Anna bundled in layers that seemed insufficient against the chill. He approached the counter for his usual supplies, flour, a bit of sugar, his breath fogging the air. Eleanor waited until Mr. Harlan turned away, then rose from her sewing table, the tart wrapped in a clean cloth, still warm from the morning's bake. She placed it on the counter beside his sack, her fingers lingering on the fabric, the heat seeping through like unspoken words. "For Anna," she said softly, her voice barely above the crackle of the potbelly stove. "And you, to ward off the cold." Thomas paused, his dark eyes meeting hers, surprise flickering briefly before settling into a deep, quiet warmth. He unwrapped a corner, the steam rising with the aroma of baked apples and spice, a scent that seemed to soften the store's stark edges. Anna stirred, her tiny nose twitching, and Thomas's hand gently covered the tart, as if cradling something precious. He didn't speak at first, just nodded, the gesture laden with gratitude that needed no elaboration. Then, in a low murmur, "It smells like home." "Thank you, Eleanor." She felt the flush of vulnerability, but also a budding courage as he tucked the tart into his coat, close to Anna. As he left, the bell jingling behind him, the snow outside seemed less oppressive, the winter's grip loosening just a fraction. In that small exchange, a bridge formed, not of grand promises, but of shared kindness, a symbol of hearts mending in the quiet thaw. The Eldridge Spring Fair unfolded under a tentative April sky, the snow finally giving way to muddy paths and the faint green of new grass pushing through the earth. The town square buzzed with life, booths draped in checkered cloth, the scent of frying dough and roasted chestnuts mingling with the tang of damp soil, children darting through the crowd with sticky fingers. Eleanor had come to sell her tarts and mended linens, her table a modest affair at the edge of the bustle, her hands smoothing the cloth with care. She wore her best dress, a simple gray muslin with a high collar, her hair pinned neatly but unadorned. The townsfolk still cast sidelong glances, their whispers softer now, but ever present. The haze woman, bold as ever, showing her face. Yet Eleanor stood tall, her chin lifted, her dignity a quiet rebellion against their judgment. Thomas arrived late in the afternoon, Anna cradled in his arms, her tiny hands clutching a wooden rattle he'd carved. His presence drew eyes. His Lakota heritage marked him as much an outsider as Eleanor's past made her, but he moved through the crowd with the same steady calm she'd come to admire. He paused at her table, his gaze lingering on the neat rows of tarts, their golden crusts gleaming in the weak sunlight. "You've been busy," he said, his voice low, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Keeps me out of trouble," she replied, her tone light, but her eyes meeting his, a shared understanding passing between them like a current. He bought 2 tarts, his fingers brushing hers as he handed over the coins, a touch so brief it might have been accidental, yet it warmed her more than the sun. As he lingered, offering Anna a bit of crust to gum, the church ladies nearby paused their chatter, their gazes sharp as needles. A rancher's wife, Mrs. Calloway, muttered loudly enough to carry, "A divorced woman and a half-breed cozying up. What's Eldridge coming to?" The words stung, but Eleanor kept her hands steady, rearranging her linens. Thomas's expression didn't change, but he stepped closer to her table, his broad frame a quiet shield, and offered Anna another nibble, his focus on the child a deliberate dismissal of the gossip. The moment shifted when a young boy tripped nearby, spilling a jar of preserves that splattered Eleanor's skirt. Before she could react, Thomas knelt, wiping the mess with his own kerchief, his movements gentle but firm. "No harm done," he said, loud enough for the onlookers, his eyes flicking to hers with a warmth that drowned out the whispers. The crowd watched, some softening, others turning away, but Eleanor felt a surge of strength. Together, they stood unbowed, their quiet solidarity a defiance sweeter than any tart. The spring air felt alive with possibility, the season's thaw mirroring the slow bloom of their bond. The night air carried the sharp chill of early spring, the stars above Eldridge sharp as pinpricks against a velvet sky. Eleanor sat on the narrow porch of the boarding house, a quilt draped over her shoulders, its patchwork squares stitched from scraps of her own worn dresses, holding the faint scent of lavender and thyme. The town was quiet, save for the distant yip of a coyote and the creak of the porch boards under her weight. Her hands rested in her lap, still for once, no needle or dough to occupy them. The fare had left her weary, but lighter. Thomas's quiet defense lingering like warmth from a dying fire. She hadn't sought him out since, but his presence felt woven into her days, a steady thread she couldn't ignore. Footsteps crunched on the path, deliberate and unhurried. Thomas emerged from the shadows, Anna asleep against his chest in her sling, her small breaths puffing like clouds. He stopped at the edge of the porch, his silhouette framed by starlight, the faint gleam of his beaded amulet catching the moon's glow. "Evening, Eleanor," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of something unspoken. "Saw your light. Hoped you'd be out here." She nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside her, her heart quickening despite her calm exterior. He sat, careful not to jostle Anna, his hands resting on his knees, fingers tracing the worn leather of his gloves. For a moment, they shared the silence, the kind that held more meaning than words ever could. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, the world vast and still around them. "You stood by me at the fair," she said finally, her voice soft, eyes on the stars. "Didn't have to, but you did." "Why?" Thomas exhaled, his breath visible in the chill. "Because I see you," he said simply. "Not what they say. Ruined, cast off. I see a woman who mends what's torn, who feeds what's hungry, who carries her scars like they're stars in her own sky. His words landed like stones in still water, rippling through. Her, lost my wife, my place among my people. I know what it is to be judged. But you keep standing. Makes me want to stand with you. Eleanor's throat tightened, her fingers gripping the quilt. She met his gaze, his dark eyes steady, holding no demand, only truth. I'm scared to hope, Thomas, she whispered, but you make me think I could. He reached out, his hand covering hers, warm and calloused, a quiet vow. No kiss followed. None was needed. The touch, the words, the shared silence under the vast Montana sky bound them closer than any vow. Her heart, long guarded, cracked open like the earth in spring, ready to bloom. Spring unfurled across Eldridge, the Montana hills blooming with wild lupine, and the air rich with the scent of thawed earth and budding cottonwoods. Eleanor's days were no longer solitary. Her work at the mercantile and boarding house kitchen now carried a quiet purpose, threaded with the steady presence of Thomas and Anna. Their bond had deepened in the weeks since that starlit night, not with grand declarations, but in shared moments, his hand steadying hers as she climbed a muddy path, her laughter as Anna grasped her finger with surprising strength. They were building something, fragile yet rooted, like the first shoots breaking through frost. One afternoon, Thomas found Eleanor behind the boarding house, kneeling in a patch of cleared earth where she'd begun a small garden. Her sleeves were rolled up, dirt smudging her wrists, as she pressed onion sets into the soil, her face softened by focus. He approached, Anna balanced on his hip, a spade in his other hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering the tool, his voice warm with the ease of familiarity. She took it, their fingers brushing, a spark of connection in the ordinary act. They worked side by side, turning soil and planting seeds, carrots, beans, a few herbs she'd bartered for at the store. Anna gurgled from a blanket nearby, batting at a sprig of sage Thomas had tucked beside her. The garden was small, practical, but to Eleanor it was a promise of permanence, a defiance of the rootless years behind her. "Never had land to call my own," she said, pausing to wipe sweat from her brow, the sun warming her shoulders. "Feels like claiming something." Thomas nodded, his eyes on the earth. "It's a start," he said. "A place to grow. For you. For Anna. For us." The words hung between them, simple but heavy, a proposal woven into the act of planting. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small carved wooden ring, its surface etched with delicate lines resembling flowing water. "Made this," he murmured, holding it out. "Not much, but it's honest. Will you wear it, Eleanor? Build this life with me?" Her breath caught, the weight of his offer settling like sunlight on her skin. She took the ring, slipping it onto her finger, the wood warm against her calluses. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears pricking her eyes. They didn't embrace, not yet. Instead, they knelt together, hands in the dirt, planting the last seeds as Anna cooed, the future taking root in the quiet rhythm of their shared labor. The town's whispers faded, irrelevant now, as their garden promised a harvest of hope, love, and a home they'd make together. The summer sun hung low over Eldridge, painting the Montana hills in hues of gold and sage, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers and warm pine. The town square, once a stage for judgment, now held a small gathering near the church, its weathered steeple casting a long shadow. Eleanor stood beside Thomas, her hand resting lightly in his, the wooden ring on her finger catching the light. Her dress, sewn from soft blue muslin with stitches so fine they seemed invisible, was her own creation, a quiet testament to her skill and resilience. Anna, cradled in Thomas's other arm, clutched a tiny bouquet of lupine, her dark eyes bright with the world's newness. The ceremony was simple, no grand affair. A handful of townsfolk attended, those who'd softened toward Eleanor's steady presence, like the miner's widow who'd savored her tarts, or the mercantile clerk who'd seen her mend more than just fabric. Mrs. Grayson stood at the back, her granite face unreadable but present. No preacher presided. Instead, a traveling judge spoke the vows, his voice steady against the hum of crickets. Eleanor and Thomas spoke their promises plainly, their words unadorned, but heavy with truth, each syllable a stitch binding their scarred pasts into a shared future. After, they walked to their new home, a small cabin at the town's edge, its walls rough-hewn but sturdy, the garden they'd planted now sprouting green with promise. The crowd followed, carrying baskets of bread and preserves, a quiet offering of acceptance. Inside, a quilt Eleanor had pieced together draped the bed, its patterns of stars and rivers echoing the symbols on Thomas's belongings, a harmony of their two worlds. The couple stood by the hearth, its fire crackling softly, and shared a single dance to a fiddler's lone tune, their steps slow and unpracticed, but sure. Anna cooed from a cradle nearby, her presence a heartbeat in the room. As the guests drifted away, Eleanor and Thomas sat on the porch, the night settling around them like a shawl. The stars gleamed above, vast and unjudging. He reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the ring he'd carved. "You reminded me who I already was," she said softly, her voice steady, the words a quiet echo of her journey from rejection to rebirth. He squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "And you, me," he replied. They sat in silence, the world at peace, their love a quiet flame that needed no blaze to endure.